Welcome to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman. Hey, Joe.
Hi, Pam. Pam, today we're going to talk about education in the law. We owe our kids a great public education, and I mean by that all of our kids, all of the country's kids.
Yeah, but even though we have that as a commitment, one of the questions is how do you make that commitment real? It's not in the Constitution directly, at least the federal Constitution. It is in state constitutions. But, what do we do about kids in poor school districts? What do we do about poor kids? What do we do about kids with special needs? Those are all really complicated questions, but it's really critical that we educate all of them.
That's right. And today our guest is going to answer those questions, or at least he's going to help us understand how the law grapples with those questions and how he does. He's Bill Koski. He's got a doctorate in education as well as a JD. He's been our colleague for many years. He's the head of the law school's Youth and Education Law Project. He's litigated scores, maybe even more than scores, of important cases. Welcome, Bill.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here, Bill. And I think maybe one place to start is the United States funds public education in a sort of odd way. And I think it might be useful to kind of lay that out.
Yeah, in many countries, there's a centralized education ministry that dictates curriculum and pays for schools and that sort of thing. The U.S. isn't that way at all. We're extremely decentralized, and most folks realize this because they go to the ballot box and vote on their school district's tax millage rates, because most schools are locally funded based on property taxes. A lot of money for our public schools also comes from states, particularly here in California. The state has a general revenue fund that it contributes most of the operational funding to school districts. Truth is, the federal government does very little in terms of the percentage of overall funding for our schools. They do some important stuff around kids with disabilities, homeless youth, and also educationally disadvantaged young people. But overall, the share of federal funding is really little. It's mostly local.
So, Bill, take us to the rich versus poor issue first. In California, at one time, if you lived in a rich district like Beverly Hills, locally funded, you got a great education, or at least a much more costly education than the person next to you in Baldwin Hills. That's no longer the case in California, is that right?
That's not the case in California. Again, in most places in the U.S., school districts are still primarily funded through local property taxes. So if you live in a school district that has huge property tax wealth because of residential property values, you're going to have more resources to play with as a school district. Now, that was true in California into the early 1970s, but there was a lawsuit called Serrano against Priest that aimed to equalize funding among property wealthy school districts and property poor school districts. And the suit did have that effect. It actually has, to some degree, equalized the general revenues that school districts receive in California. Now, there are still great variations because of facilities that are funded through local property taxes as well. But by and large, California has evened it out. Many states haven't. There are plenty of states where we see huge differences just by crossing the school district line.
And that means, for example, in some school districts they have AP courses, they have music and art, and in other school districts they just don't have that stuff.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, money buys stuff. Money buys educational resources. The most important thing that money buys is high quality teachers, and that's one thing that we see a lot of variation among school districts is the quality of the teachers, as measured by the value that they add to their students, as measured by the years of education, and frankly, as measured by the number of years they've been teaching effectively. Other resources are more tangible and visible. You've seen nice auditoriums in some school districts, gymnasiums, Olympic swimming pools, if we're talking athletic departments. You see some school districts with bands and choruses and that sort of thing. Others don't. I mean, money does buy things that are important for kids.
At one point, some of us thought, Bill, that if we equalized money, everything else would take care of itself because we had such an unequal disparity of money, and it's still true in a lot of states. Today in California, we have relatively equal money, depending on how you look at it. What's gone on? It seems like we still have these real serious differences in educational achievements and outcomes, rich versus poor districts.
Yeah, I want to be careful about one thing. In California, in terms of the operating revenues, we're relatively equal. There are some things where we're still quite unequal, as I mentioned before. But, given that, you would expect to see things like the achievement gap between rich and poor school districts closing, between children of color and affluent white children closing. We don't necessarily see that in California. So the cynical take is, well, money doesn't matter. Look at all the money we spent. We just dumped it into poor performing school districts with administrations that were at worst corrupt, at best inept. And that critique is possibly well taken. Although the one thing we do know is that money well spent, money that's spent where it's going to have its biggest bang, is effective.
And the biggest bang is the quality of the teaching?
The classroom. I mean, that's when we get the money the closest to the classroom, the closest to hiring high quality teachers. That, I think, is one good investment. Now, there's other things, of course, that matter.
And do we know what, at the hiring stage, do we know what to be looking for in hiring a high quality versus a not high quality teacher?
This is a vexing question. Ask any school administrator, ask any principal. Can they tell at the interview stage how good someone is going to be as a teacher? Sure, there's some indicators. Things you would think might be good indicators aren't necessarily so. Do they have a certificate of a proper certificate? Do they have certain kinds of educational credit hours? Those aren't great indicators. But there's other things that do become good indicators once there are teachers. So from my perspective, I think the hiring process is important, but more important than that is the developmental process for a teacher and supporting them throughout their career, helping them get better, and also finding those teachers who aren't performing well and counsel them in different directions.
What is a new wave of litigation on funding? We've talked about equality, and we've seen very important, maybe it prevented some worsening of the gap that might have occurred for other reasons, but it's not everything. What are ways your clinic and other people are litigating to help poor kids in underperforming districts?
Yeah, I think you're asking the question of, what is it that we're doing to establish the right to an education? What does that right to an education look like? For a long time, that might have been viewed as the right to a desegregated or desegregated education, an education in which children of all races and ethnicities would go to school together. For a while, it became what we were talking about a moment ago, these equity litigations where we were trying to basically equalize funding among schools and school districts. Well, one thing that we notice is that among states, there's a lot of variation in performance. There's actually some states that are extremely poor performing compared to other states. And we also notice that even in those states, the higher, or I would say the wealthier communities also didn't do that well. So there was a turn at some point towards what's called adequacy litigation, trying to establish a baseline standard for what all kids should know and be able to do, and then ensuring that the state provided the amount of money to fund that education. So this is the litigation that's been going on at least for the last 3 decades.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with our colleague Bill Koski about public education.
So we're talking about adequacy legislation and litigation. That is, maybe the funding isn't equal, but every child ought to get X. It's a little bit, in my mind, related to the concept of No Child Left Behind. How has that worked out in your opinion?
Right. So No Child Left Behind actually was a continuation of what was called the standards-based reform movement, where states and other jurisdictions were establishing content standards for what all kids should know and be able to do at each grade level in each subject matter. It's a terrific idea, and it was an important idea from a progressive standpoint because it raised expectations for all kids. We believe that all kids can perform well, right? So we also then decided to ensure that our curricula were aligned to that, also making sure that our teachers were trained to that. And then the question became, are we actually going to give them the funding, the opportunity to learn those standards? We never really did that in a meaningful way. We did, however, do what No Child Left Behind did, and that is hold schools accountable for performance on these standards. In some instances, holding kids accountable, think about high school exit exams. In other instances, holding teachers and school districts accountable for some of the things that you saw during No Child Left Behind. How has it worked out? Well, I think we've learned a lot, and I think we're now moving in a slightly different direction. High-stakes accountability is not where we are right now. We are looking a little bit more towards how we can provide better opportunities to learn. That said, we are using standards still to highlight those areas where performance is poor and where kids need help. And I think that's been a good contribution of the standards-based reform and the assessment movements.
Because it turns out, people talk about this crisis of public education in the United States, but it's a kind of localized crisis. It's not everywhere in the country, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. There was a lot of sky is falling rhetoric, especially in the 80s and 90s, about American public education. And the truth is, there are pockets of very low performance. And usually those are aligned with high poverty areas, whether it's cities that are performing very poorly. I think Detroit, Baltimore, places like that. And in fact, there are some states that do quite poorly. Generally speaking, and this is no knock on any particular jurisdiction, but California and the Deep South doesn't do necessarily as well on average compared to northeastern and northern tier states. So there are things to learn from high-performing states, and there are also things that need to be provided to poor performing jurisdictions, cities, counties, what have you.
So the high performing states, what accounts for them being high performing?
I'm a person who has spent most of my career trying to litigate and advocate for resources. I think money matters. I don't think willy-nilly spending money on bad infrastructure is a good thing, but I do think it matters. So resources is number one. In my view, we need to lead with the resources. We need to ensure that the basic educational necessities are provided to all, that our best and highest quality teachers are teaching in the hardest to staff places, because that's where we're going to get the most bang from it.
Is that one of those things, though, where there's this temptation, if you're a really good teacher, you can kind of move up and out and move to a more attractive district so that in some sense, the attractive districts cream the best of the teachers off of the pile?
In metropolitan areas, we do see that. I think of here on the San Francisco Peninsula, there are some very low-income, poor-performing school districts where teachers might cut their teeth, so to speak, but they'll move on to greener pastures. Teachers look at a lot of different things when they're making choices about where to teach. Among them is money, but that's not even necessarily the biggest one. They're looking at the conditions that they're working in, how hard it's going to be to teach. Do they have the supports that they need in their classroom to teach, instructional aids? And importantly, that's in metropolitan areas. Importantly, teacher labor markets in rural areas, they're super local. Teachers teach where they grew up, by and large. And that's true in a lot of different places. That's not to say that we can't attract high-quality teachers to poor schools.
It's so interesting to hear all the factors that go into this. And I'm tempted to follow up on it, but I want to raise something that a lot of our listeners and viewers are thinking about is, how about charter schools? Are we jumping out of our problems to go to charter schools? And what is a charter movement like, say, in California?
Right. So I'm not sure all the listeners know exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about charter schools. So if you'll indulge me, I'll provide a little definition here. Charter schools are public schools. Let's start with that. I think a lot of people don't realize that. They think somehow that there are public schools and there are charter schools. Charter schools are publicly funded schools. But they are different in the sense that they've been freed from many of the regulations that traditional public schools are under. And in addition to that, they are allowed to operate outside of school districts and operate independently.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with our colleague Bill Koski about public education. And Bill, you were just explaining charter schools are public schools, but they're not run by the local school board directly.
That's correct. And that's sort of the beauty of charter schools on some level is, from a political and policy standpoint, from an ideological standpoint, it is sort of the happy confluence of people on the one hand who have a vision of what education should be, teachers, parents, kids, and they want to open up their own school, and they're using public monies to do that, homegrown charter schools. Or there are people who see that I want to open up a school and target kids who need the education the most. So there are charter school networks or charter school management organizations that do just that. You can think about KIPP or Aspire there. So that's the one hand, this very progressive notion. On the other hand, there's this very almost libertarian notion about charter schools where what we need to do is inject a little competition into the system and allow people to open up these charter schools to put pressure on traditional public schools to improve. And the one place where I think all of this meets is when we have kids in low-performing schools, we want to give them the choice that people in affluent suburbs already have, and that is to live in the place where there's a school that they want their kids to go to. And so that's where there's this happy marriage. Charter schools started in the early 1990s. The movement is very strong, although there are some suggestions that at least momentarily it's plateaued. Here in California, we have some school districts that have upwards of 30% of their students enrolled in charter schools.
And that's Oakland's one of those.
Correct,
isn't it?
yes. And Los Angeles Unified School District also is the largest chartering authority in the United States, meaning they charter the largest number of charter schools. So the bargain that's cut with charter schools is we'll free you from a lot of regulations as long as you live up to your charter, your agreement to perhaps improve student performance or perhaps run a better school or do something like that. And so that's where the sort of rub is right now. How do we hold charter schools accountable? How do we ensure that they're providing an equitable education, making sure that all kids can get into charter schools? And how do we ensure that they're providing the right outcomes for kids?
And what have the outcomes been? Is there any kind of big picture on whether charter schools have in fact improved the educational outcomes of kids?
Yeah, my answer to that question is which charter schools are we talking about? There is a lot of research on this subject. Here at Stanford, in fact, an organization called Credo has studied this among many others. And I think the most that I'm willing to say on the research is that charter schools on average do as well as, and in some pockets maybe slightly better than traditional public schools. There are many examples of excellent charter schools doing amazing things with hard-to-serve kids, and there are some examples of charter schools essentially stealing money from the public fisc. So there's a lot of variation among schools and among jurisdictions.
So does that mean that it seems like charter schools put a lot of pressure in a weird way on parents to make choices rather than just relying on the idea that a local school district is going to provide their kid with an excellent education? Is there any evidence on whether there are certain kinds of parents who are just better at picking charter schools for their kids?
Yeah, so the very notion of charter schools is that they're schools of choice, right? And so parents have to have the information, they have to have the time, they have to have the sophistication to get their kids both into a lottery sometimes if it's an oversubscribed charter school, or at least enrolled in a charter school. So there is a lot of pressure. And I do think one thing that we see overall is that at a minimum, parents who find their way to charter schools and kids who find their way to charter schools are a little bit more sophisticated educational consumers. There's no better way to put it. I'm not going to put the sense that some are richer or some are poor. They're just more sophisticated and perhaps more committed to their children's education. And for those who are parents that are listeners, everybody knows that that's another really important variable in terms of kid outcomes, how much the parent and family is committed.
Yeah, we have a colleague who says the smartest thing you can do as a child is to pick the right parents.
Right.
Which is...
So it is a little bit like the rich get richer, even with the charter school movement. If you're rich in the sense of having a parent who's in your camp and who's a good consumer, you're going to do better. Yeah,
you're going to do better provided that there is a charter school option available for you, or provided there's some other choice option. Some school districts, by the way, have what's called open choice or open enrollment, where you can enroll in whatever school you want to. There may be some lottery involved with that, but again, it requires choice in the parent. So when we think about how to allocate spaces in good schools, we need to think beyond just having parents have choice. How do we attract everybody to good schools?
We'll be back with more from our guest Bill Koski talking about public education next on Stanford Legal here on Sirius XM Insight 121. Welcome back to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman.
Hi, we're here talking with Bill Koski. And Bill, a minute ago we were talking about teachers, and your position is it's really all about the teacher more than anything else. Does the law have anything to say about teacher hiring, teacher firing?
Yeah, on the one hand, the law says a little bit about what it takes to become a teacher, preparation.
Sorry, halt. We need to reset here.
Okay.
We did not actually get cleared.
Okay.
Actually, well, so we're not going live or anything like that.
Okay.
We want to go live on Stanford Legal.
Yeah. So you'll just tell us when, is that right?
Terry will.
Yeah, okay.
Just for the last part or the whole thing?
I assume just the last part, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, just the last, just like the last 2 minutes.
We're not.
We're going to see if you can do it again with
Yes, screw up.
consistency.
Oh, God.
See whether there are.
Those are gems.
What are those-
We'll
what are those
never
called?
recreate
No,
that
no.
magic.
We're going to see if we're going to impeach you with your prior inconsistent statement.
That's what I'm worried
We're
about.
ready to go.
Something
Do you
different.
remember me asking this question and you giving this answer?
Exactly 15 minutes ago?
Yeah. I always loved doing that. Did you remember my asking you this question and you're giving me this answer? No, I don't remember it.
He said,
Hold on one second, Terry.
We
Yeah.
swore you in. You took a deposition.
Yeah. Do you remember that you were under
Jim
oath
will
that
let
day?
you know when it's ready. So,
Okay, thank you.
Do you remember being under oath that day?
Yeah, exactly.
You know that's never a good start
Yeah.
when you're being deposed or cross-examined.
Cross-examined, right?
Yeah.
Let me refresh your recollection.
That's what I usually do. I usually don't impeach. It was
Yeah.
always too risky to impeach
Yeah.
in my mind. You
Yeah,
gotta
it's
be
always better just to say,
yeah.
can I refresh your recollection on this? Do you remember my giving you this question and you're giving me this answer? Were you on drugs that day?
Exactly. Which one is correct? The one in my office or the one today?
Yeah.
That's a good
Yeah.
one.
If someone were to say you were a liar, would they be correct about that?
Finish this. Blank, pencil.
We are ready to go,
fire.
Terry. You got me?
Okay.
All right, the control room is ready to go.
Okay.
All right. You ready up here?
Yep.
Okay. 5, 4, 3.
Welcome back to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman.
Bill, we're here with Bill Koski, and a bit ago we were talking about the determinants of a good school, and it's kind of all about the teacher. Does the law have anything to say about who gets hired as a teacher, who gets fired as a teacher? Should the law get into that?
Right. There are many, as you said, determinants
Yes.
for outcomes in education. My view is that it's harder to find a more important one than teachers. So let's figure out how we can hire high-quality teachers. The law says a little bit about this. At the outset, there are some preparatory requirements for teachers, certification requirements and the like, but not a lot, education requirements. Once a teacher is hired, however, there are various layers of teacher employment protections that are out there. Those that are created by collective bargaining agreements, those are created by state statutes and the like. And some folks have often said that these employment protections are overprotective and that they're hampering the ability of administrators to fire low-quality teachers.
Wasn't there a big story in the New Yorker? It was about, they called it something like the rubber room or something in New York, where the people who couldn't teach but had tenure all got sent there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, one of the protections one has as a teacher once you've achieved tenure is that there are some due process protections available before you can be fired. And so the rubber room, as I understand it, was the purgatory where they put teachers who were going through that process because they couldn't quite fire them. You know, and those kinds of stories and that kind of, I want to call it slight hysteria, frankly, around all these poor teachers led to this movement that started about 8 or 10 years ago to try to reform teacher employment protections. Some of it was done legislatively. Think about Wisconsin and the fact that the governor there tried to reduce public employee benefits, but also through litigation. There was a case called Vergara here in California that attempted to basically get rid of teacher tenure in California, or at least lengthen the time to tenure before you receive these kinds of protections. The suit was ultimately ineffective, but it did launch a legislative and litigation effort to try to reform teacher employment protections. From my perspective, yes, there might need to be some reform on the margins, but it's not as though we're going to be able to fire our way out of having a poor quality teaching force. We need to attract teachers. We need to attract young people to the profession, and especially to the hardest places to teach. And so from my perspective, litigating around the resources again is more important here. That said, it's incredibly useful to think about, okay, how can we support teachers who are struggling? What can we do to counsel them into another profession? Great policy questions. So far, there hasn't been much successful litigation around those issues, but I do think these are important things to think about from a policy perspective.
And this has been an interesting political issue for some of us because the litigation was started by people that would be associated, for example, with the Republican governor of Wisconsin. It was conservative in nature, anti-teachers union in nature, but it was supported by a lot of people on the progressive left thinking that we in poor areas are the ones that are getting stuck with these underperforming teachers. So you have kind of a new political alliance on the one hand. At the same time, you have a lot of teacher political organization on the other.
That's right. And what's interesting, that created a schism within the Democratic Party, to be specific here. Those who considered themselves reformers, although some derisively called them corporatist reformers, folks like Michelle Rhee. Some would even say former Secretary of Education Arnie Duncan would fall into that camp. And these were folks who are dyed-in-the-wool, shall we call them, liberals on the one hand, but they were aligned more with the conservative forces on this particular issue. Now, what we've seen in the past couple of years is perhaps a pendulum swing back in the other direction. Teachers have refound their voice, regained their footing. You look at teachers organizing in a place like Oklahoma, where they were dramatically underpaid and where they became a political force in that state to have their salaries raised and improve their working conditions. So in a way, I think we're going to reach kind of an equilibrium, perhaps even a grand bargain where we'll pay teachers more for some reform to go along with it. I mean, that would be my ultimate dream.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with our colleague Bill Koski about public education. Joe?
Well, you mentioned your dream, Bill, and I, for one, value it because you're somebody that's been litigating this for your professional life. You're also somebody that has a moral opinion and a thought of what works, and your mother's a teacher, too.
That's correct. My mom taught special ed for 50 years. I'm not sure whether she's crazy or should be sanctified. Maybe both. Who knows?
My mom taught special ed, too. And this brings us to another piece of your work that you do, especially in your clinic, which is to work on the individualized entitlement of kids to a free and appropriate public education. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So I direct something called the Youth and Education Law Project, as Joe said at the outset, YELP, we call it. And our work is with Stanford law students in representing children and youth, primarily in special education and school discipline related matters. And specifically, we work with a lot of youth who have behavioral and emotional disabilities, kids who are on the autism spectrum, kids with learning disabilities who are trying to get a free and appropriate public education. What's interesting about this group of children is that they do have a federal statutory right to some type of education that most kids don't. What's difficult for this group of kids is that their parents are put in the odd position of being the police officers, those to enforce the rights. So we essentially help the parents and the children enforce those rights through individualized education plan meetings, mediations, and due process hearings. We also do some wide-ranging structural reform around special education as well.
And when we talk about special education, this isn't something that's just affecting a few people. My guess is all of our viewers or listeners know somebody who's getting some special education. It's a family that has an autistic child, it's someone else with special needs or a learning disability.
That's right. I mean, our best estimates are about 13% or so of all kids in the United States have some kind of identified or unidentified disability. A lot of those kids have learning disabilities, about 8% or so. So that's a lot of folks that are affected by it. Some people who are quite well known. And what is interesting is the political coalition around youth and children with disabilities is a diverse coalition, as you could imagine, because it affects people from all different walks of life. That said, from the public education perspective, it's very, very expensive to educate kids with disabilities and realize this entitlement.
And I know one of the issues involved in this legally is just what is a disability? And you're doing some really interesting litigation on trauma.
Right. So we're involved with one piece of litigation that is part of a series of cases brought to make the case that childhood trauma in and of itself, because of its effect on children's brains, the neuroscience is very clear on this, ought to constitute a disability such that schools and school districts have to accommodate that and have to make services and interventions available for children who've experienced childhood trauma. This is, a novel piece of litigation, but I think more importantly, the education community itself is recognizing that trauma-informed learning, recognizing that kids who might express behavioral difficulties or problems have had their own problems in their past. Let's not kick them out of school. Let's figure out how to work with them.
Tell me about the litigants in that litigation.
So the particular case that you're talking about is a case that I'm working with my colleague Tara Ford, among others, called Stephensi against the Bureau of Indian Education, where we represent children in the Havasupai Native American tribe. And the children in that tribe that we represent have alleged that whatever they're getting in their schools, you can't call it an education. Now, these are folks who live at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Some folks I'm sure have visited Supai before, and the federal government is responsible for providing them an adequate education, and our work is to ensure that that right is realized for those kids.
Well, we've been talking here with Bill Koski, and what we've looked at is maybe the most important thing we ever talk about, which is education. How can we fund it, and how should we fund it? What about the charter movement? Is that going to be a solution? And my guess is there are a lot of threads that we just didn't have time to pursue. I'm guessing the champions of the charter movement are saying give it time, and everybody will recognize the winners. And other people are saying it's creaming, having some adverse selection that's bringing us all down. And finally, we looked at special education, which is something that really touches everyone. And some of the threads we've left hanging, and I'm sorry to do this, is how can we afford to give everybody the education we want?
And the tension between spending money on some kids and spending money on others. I mean, I remember cases where a school district has to spend $70,000 on one kid's education. Then the question is, what do you do about the other kids? I mean, perhaps we can have you back to talk about those tensions, Bill.
I'd be
so
delighted.
Thanks for joining us here on Stanford Legal on Sirius XM Insight 121.